some of my more recent research that I've been working on over the past few years. And let me just begin by saying the basic motivation, the basic question behind this research is, how do you get stuff to the very poorest of the poor? That's essentially what my research is asking. Over the past several years, I've assembled several research teams and projects around the world, and will continue to do this over the next several years. So the Millennium Development Goals, of course, were a phenomenal success. It was, I think, a phenomenal testament to intergovernmental cooperation, public-private partnerships, the role of NGOs, activists, the private sector, and so on. So much so that we've now moved into the era of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think one of the main things that I want to stress in this transformation from the MDGs to the SDGs is, whereas the MDGs sought to reduce poverty and to reduce the levels of underdevelopment, particularly in the global south, the SDGs actually have a much more ambitious goal, which is to eliminate these things. And so when you look, for instance, at SDG number 1, it can't be any more unequivocal than this: to end poverty in all its forms, everywhere. Right? So this is a pretty unequivocal statement of goals and intentions. The question before us in terms of the international development community is, how are we going to actually achieve this? So there are several arguments being laid out there. You know, one argument is that we should do more of the same. We did a phenomenal job with the MDGs. As long as we continue to invest more, do more, innovate more, then we should be able to achieve the SDGs. The other argument, the one that I want to stress, is in fact doing more of the same is not going to allow us to achieve the SDGs, but rather we actually have to think much more innovatively. I would actually put forth the argument, in part to be provocative, but I think also in part because I believe this, is that the MDGs actually reached, we were able to achieve the MDGs because we were able to reach those who were relatively easy to reach. If we truly want to achieve the SDGs, we have to reach those who have been left behind. And we have to reach those who are fundamentally difficult to reach. Indeed, we already know what to do in many respects. We know, for instance, access to clean water. We know, for instance, access to nutrition. We know that, for instance, exclusive breastfeeding. We know, for instance, primary education. These are all things that we can deliver in order to improve the lives that are living at the base of the pyramid. We know what to do. There are already a lot of great ideas out there. The challenge, however, is how do we actually deliver these great ideas? How do we deliver these interventions to those who are hardest to reach? And so, as I concluded in a piece that I recently had published in the Bulletin of the WHO, the complicated real-world challenge is actually delivering services to reach those most in need, and more specifically, to those who are hardest to reach. I want to reiterate again, the MDGs in many ways, or in many respects, were the easy task at hand. The SDGs pose a much more difficult challenge. And it poses precisely a much more difficult challenge because we have to reach those who are left behind. So when we go back and we look at the data from the MDGs, for instance, there are a lot of aggregate successes to celebrate. When we look at national level data, we can see, for instance, many countries that have improved development indicators and outcomes over baseline, which leads us to, I think, a very good feeling about the achievements that we were able to accomplish in the SDGs. However, when you begin to disaggregate this data, you actually see a very different story. So, for instance, a colleague of mine that I work with at Sick Kids Hospital in the University of Toronto has pointed out that when you look, for instance, at countries that showed aggregate improvements in maternal child health outcomes over baseline, when you actually look at those countries, 2/3 of them experience growing levels of inequality. When you, for instance, unpack aggregate level data in Latin America and you begin to look at sub-regional data, you can see that over time, while some regions within countries improve their maternal child health outcomes, some countries, in fact, got worse over time. Indeed, when you think about it and you look at the distribution of the world's poorest of the poor, whereas a generation and a half ago, the world's poorest people lived in the world's poorest countries, the reality is now that the vast majority of the world's poorest people live in middle-income countries. That is to say that we've figured out how to grow economies in the aggregate, but we have not figured out how to deliver the benefits of that growth to those who are hardest to reach. And so as Anthony Lake from UNICEF points out, when you disaggregate the data, we find that our statistically national successes are masking moral and practical failures. People are left behind simply because they live in rural communities or urban slums, in conflict zones, as part of indigenous groups, disabilities, or simply because they are girls. So the research agenda that I'm putting forth is a research agenda to reach the poorest of the poor. The challenge, however, is to reach the poorest of the poor, or the challenge, however, is that the poorest of the poor are also the hardest to reach. So in the course of doing research in the field, one of the questions that always comes up is, how do you deliver a multi-course vaccine in a slum in which people don't have addresses? I mean, there's a very practical challenge, but one I think that stands in the way of, in fact, achieving the SDGs. Consider, for instance, that until recently, half of India did not have a formal ID. Consider that as of 2013, 230 million children in the world under the age of 5 did not have their births registered, which means they don't have a birth certificate, which means they have limited access to health and education basic services. Consider that in most slums, which are by definition illegal squatter settlements, people do not have addresses. Consider those that live in the deep countryside. People are very distant from urban centers and so on, in which we would expect to see social services. So what we have before us then are dual challenges of reach and redistribution. The challenge of reach, of course, rests with this very fundamental tension between the fact that we rely on the formal mechanisms of delivery, that is to say, we rely on things like addresses, identification, birth certificates. We rely on these formal mechanisms to deliver things to people who live, frankly, very informal lives. So you can see, as a political scientist, the theoretical intrigue of that kind of question. But from a very practical point of view, you can also see the technical challenges of trying to reach those who are, for all intents and purposes, invisible. But whereas on one hand there's a technical challenge of reach, there is also, I would suggest to you, a very political, economic quandary of redistribution. Because we tend to assume that as you expand programs, we should realize the economies of scale, thereby reducing the cost of interventions as we have additional enrollees. The fact of the matter is that in fact the marginal cost to deliver, or the marginal cost to deliver to the additional enrollee, actually rises as opposed to decreases as we try to reach those that are hardest to reach. The cost of a vaccine doesn't go up. The cost of delivering that vaccine to a very hard to reach person does go up. What this means then is that we're talking about a political economy of redistribution. So we have a technical challenge, but we also have a political economic challenge. So over the course of the last several years and into the future, we're putting together case studies of successful examples of reach. And one of the more recent ones we've done is the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. The Bolsa Familia program is a conditional cash transfer program that covers 48 million people in Brazil, about a quarter of the population, or 14 million households. Studies have shown that it has had a positive effect on most social and economic indicators, including short-term poverty relief, and we've also not seen the cash transfer act as a disincentive for work. In other words, the program is working. But what was most intriguing for us, however, was the one data point that showed that 75% of the resources from the central government actually made it to the bottom income quintile. By comparison, in other Latin American countries, the reach rate is about 30 to 50%. So Brazil is not known for, is known for things like clientelism and corruption. So the fact of the matter that we actually reduce fiscal leakage is quite remarkable. The question for us then was, how have they done it? What are the mechanisms that they have put into place in order to reach these populations? And again, poverty in Brazil is extraordinarily diverse. The countryside in Bahia, those living in the Amazon rim, to those living in the favelas in the urban centers. There are many reasons, but I just want to highlight one. The way in which this program works is it's built upon the Cadastro Único, which is a central registry in which people register their households to qualify for Bolsa Familia. In lieu of an address, so in the questionnaire they do ask for an address, but many of the world's poorest of the poor don't have an address. So in lieu of an address, you can in fact put down a qualitative description of where you live. I live in this favela, in this alley, in this lane, past the Loteria house, past the second latrine, second floor, red door, right? That's what's entered into the database. It's precisely that precision combined with big data that has allowed Bolsa Familia to be so successful. Last slide then. So what does this mean in terms of the SDGs? I just want to highlight 4 very briefly implications. The first is what I'm suggesting here is a fundamental change in how we're doing development, a change in our focus on to delivery. The second implication is that we ought to change our focus from provision to reach. Instead of evaluating the success of our development interventions in terms of provision, we ought to begin to evaluate it in terms of their reach, which of course has measurement implications. Third, as we think about infrastructure then, not only are we thinking about built infrastructure to reduce the transaction costs of economic growth, but this is a perfect opportunity to begin to think about infrastructure as a way of reaching the poorest of the poor. And very lastly, it reflects a change in political will. If indeed this requires a political economy of redistribution, it's not just simply getting our technical people out there figuring out ways to reach the poorest of the poor, but it also means creating a sustainable, viable political coalition to support these initiatives. Thank you.